Hello, I'm Trent Bullock, Senior Pastor of First Baptist Church in Paris, Tennessee. Thank you for joining our broadcast today. As we begin to look toward Easter and the celebration of Jesus' resurrection, I'll be sharing with you a series of messages based on the 7 last words of Christ from the cross. In today's message from Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, verses 33 and 34, we will consider Christ's first words from the cross, "Father, forgive them." Right now, I invite you to join us as we worship the Lord. We need to learn to forgive others just as Jesus taught us to forgive others. Holding a grudge is easy. I'm reminded of the story of a woman who was bitten by a dog. And they thought that the dog might have rabies. And so they rushed her to the hospital and to the emergency room, and there they began treatment. And as she was in one of the rooms there, an intern came in and he began to explain to her the seriousness of what had happened. He began to explain to her all the possible results of her being bitten by a dog if that dog in fact had rabies. And so while they were waiting for the test results on that dog and he was explaining all this to her, this intern realized as he was explaining that she was visibly shaken by what she was hearing. He left the room for a few moments and he came back to check on her to see how she was doing. And when he came back to the room, as he entered the room, he noticed that she was sitting there and she had a piece of paper and a pencil, and she was kind of looking off into space for a few moments, and then she would write something down, and then she would pause and she would think for a moment and she would write something down. And he thought to himself, I have really scared her. I've really frightened her by what I told her. And so he tried to comfort her. And as he was speaking to her, he said, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you by what I said to you and how I explained to you what might happen if this dog does turn out to have rabies. I can't help but notice that you were writing. You're not writing out your will. You're not writing out some instructions for your family, are you? And she says, oh no, I'm making a list of people that I want to bite just in case I have rabies. She was holding on to a grudge. She was holding on to some bitterness and some unforgiveness about some people, and she was going to exact her revenge upon them. You see, that's our natural response, isn't it? Our natural response is to hold on to that and that hurt and to allow it to grow into bitterness. But Jesus taught us to forgive. To forgive. Jesus, as he was dying upon the cross, he uttered those last words, first of all, words of a prayer, Father. He was praying to his Father. And then the words of a petition, and his petition was, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. Even as they were nailing him to the cross. Father, forgive them. You see, if we allow bitterness and a grudge to well up inside of us, if we allow that unforgiving spirit to continue in our lives, it's like a virus. And it will infect all of our relationships. It will infect those around us. And that's not what we want. And that's not what Jesus wants. He wants us to learn to be forgiving just as he is forgiving. Some of his final words were the words of a petition. Father, forgive them. But I want you to know something else about this passage, something else about these final words. Not only were they the words of a prayer and the words of a petition, but they were also the words of a plea. They were the words of a plea. Notice this. He says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Not only was Jesus praying to his Father and asking him to forgive them, but he was almost arguing on their behalf. He was pleading with the Father, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't know what they're doing. Now, I want you to understand very quickly that when he prayed this and asked this, it doesn't mean that everybody's automatically forgiven just because Jesus prayed this prayer. That's not the case. And it doesn't mean that we are forgiven or we get off light or we get off free because of ignorance. That's not the case. I mean, if I go out here when I leave church in a little while and I head home and I head up Highway 79, and I don't realize what the speed limit is. And one of those fine officers pulls me over and informs me how fast I'm going. Just because I didn't know what the speed limit was doesn't exempt me from getting a ticket, does it? No. In the same way, ignorance of a sin does not excuse us. He's not saying, well, just forgive everybody. That's not what he is saying. That's really not what his petition was about. His petition and his plea was for an opportunity for everyone to experience forgiveness. It was an opportunity to experience forgiveness. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand that I really am the Son of God. They don't really understand that I am the Messiah. They don't understand that I am dying for the sins of the world. And yes, Father, I'm dying for their sins too. They don't understand that. They don't understand it. But that's exactly what he was doing. He was dying on the cross that day so that everyone would have the opportunity to have their sins forgiven. Everyone would have that opportunity to have a relationship with the Father. You see, most of us, before we come to Christ, really don't understand all about His suffering and His death. Before we come to Christ, we really don't understand everything about salvation. We're in the dark, so to speak. But yet, through God's Holy Spirit, He is able to convict us of our sin. He's able to convict us of our need for salvation. And yes, what Jesus did on the cross has provided that opportunity already for us to have our sin forgiven when we come to that place and we recognize our need for forgiveness. He was providing the opportunity for them to have their sins forgiven. He was pleading, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Luke records these words in Acts chapter 13 and verse 27. He says, the people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus, yet in condemning Him they fulfilled the words of the prophets that are read every Sabbath. They didn't know what they were doing. Paul, who experienced God's grace in an amazing way. Paul, the persecutor of the church. Paul, who had Christians put in prison. He experienced God's grace. And in writing to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 13, he says this, even though I was once a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man, I was shown mercy because I acted in ignorance and unbelief. He experienced God's grace. He was able to experience God's forgiveness because of what Jesus did on the cross. And all of us have had that experience if we are believers in Jesus. And all who have not had that opportunity to have their sins forgiven as well. Jesus died that we might have the possibility of forgiveness. And then even as He was dying, He taught us to forgive others. I read the story of a little boy named Joshua who received a brand new bicycle for his birthday. And he was so proud of that bicycle, and he loved to take that bicycle and he would ride it around the neighborhood, and he would ride as long as he could until his mom said, it's time to come in, Joshua, it's time to come in. He loved that bicycle. Well, one day he was at home and he looked out the window and he noticed that there was a man in front of their house, and he was loading Joshua's bicycle into his car. Joshua ran out the door and he started hollering, stop, stop. But the man drove off with his bicycle in the back of his car.